نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم ما بعد والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. A request to detail the seasonal festivities which normally take place in the West and what's Islam's view with respect to celebrating them. To start off with, first of all, we need to draw a distinction between those acts which are religious acts and those acts which are just acts associated of a people due to their nationalism or their tribalism or their ethnicity or some other identifier which is not a religious identifier. So that's the distinction that needs to be drawn. So any acts which have a religious basis, even if that religious basis no longer exists now, then those acts are considered as acts of religion, and Muslims cannot partake in those acts which are religious acts. Muslims, however, can partake in acts which are tribal, ethnic. So, if a person is from a Pashto background, Pathan, then there might be certain behaviors, practices which are quite particular to that group, but it's nothing to do with religion. It's very much the practices of those people and has been, irrespective of what religion has come and gone over those people. Similarly, it could be an English act, and obviously the English were originally pagans, and following on from being pagans, they became Christians, and now obviously English, it's a sort of a multicultural, multi-religious society, so there's mixed religions. So there could be acts which are, or practices which are not religious. So those which are religious are impermissible, even if the source is religious, but it's now changed. It's a religious act. Just because people don't consider it to be a religious act, or just because people don't practice it as a religious act, it is irrelevant. And those practices which aren't religious based, but are national, ethnic, cultural, tribal, whatever you want to call it, then those are permissible. So what I will do, and this is accompanied by a text, is I'll go through them one by one. And I may do is keep these recordings short, so I might do it in bits. Well, first of all is New Year's Day. New Year's Day dates back to about 4,000 years ago to the ancient Babylon, if I could pronounce it properly. And this was due to the first moon, which came in late March, and this was considered the start of the new year. And this was marked with an occasion of a religious festival called Akitu, which is derived from the Sumerian word for barley, which was cut around springtime. And Atiku was celebrated, and it was a mythical victory over the Babylonian sky god of Marduk, over the evil sea goddess Tiamat. So you can clearly see it had a religious basis. And in Egypt, it was a year which began with the annual flooding of the Nile, and that coincided with the rising of the star Sirius. And with the Chinese, it was when the second moon took place after the Winter Solstice. So it was obviously very much certain cultures religious based and certain cultures to do with harvest. How did January the 1st become New Year's Day? Well, the Roman calendar was based on consisted of 10 months and 304 days, and each new year started at the vernal equinox. And this was created by Romulus, who was the founder of Rome around 8th century BC. And over the centuries, the calendar falls out of sync with the sun, and then Julius Caesar, around 46 BC, tries to solve the problem by consulting the astronomers and mathematicians, and he introduced the Julian calendar, which then is quite close to the Gregorian calendar. And as part of his reform, Caesar initiated January the 1st as the first day of the year. Why? To honor the month's namesake, which is Janus, the Roman god of beginnings, whose two faces allowed him to look back into the past and into the future. So Romans celebrated by offering sacrifices to Janus, exchanging gifts with one another, decorating their homes with laurel branches, and attending parties. The Europeans, the Christians in Europe, obviously replaced the 1st of January because of its pagan culture, because of its pagan origins, and instead they tried to give significance to December the 25th, which was claimed to be the birth of Jesus, or Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and March the 25th, which was the Feast of Annunciation. But then around 1582, Pope Gregory the 13th re-established January the 1st as New Year's Day. So you can clearly see the religious practice behind that act. Saint Valentine Valentine's Day, there's some mystery behind that. We know it's around February. It's got to do with something of romance. Where's it come about? Well, it contains both Christian and ancient Roman tradition, as you will find with most practices within Europe. And we also see with most practices within Europe is that they have started as Roman practices, pagan practices, which have then been Christianized in order for the people to carry on celebrating it, but not feel as if though they're doing anything wrong. And now what we're seeing is the Islamification of these acts, so that we don't feel we're doing anything wrong. The Catholic Church considers 3 saints with the name Valentine or Valentinus, and they were killed. Well, there's different ikhtilafat as to who he was. He was a priest that existed, who had outlawed. So what happened is an Emperor Claudius had outlawed marriage for young men, and what he tried to do was he tried to get married. He tried to perform the marriage for young couples, young lovers in secret, and when he was found out, he was put to death. There's other talk as well of the fact that where is he? There he is. He'd been killed for attempting to help Christians escape the harsh Roman prisons, beaten, tortured, imprisoned, and he fell in love with the young girl, possibly the jailer's daughter, who used to visit him, and he wrote her the first Valentine he said, "From your Valentine." Again, no one really knows. Allah knows best as to the truth behind it. But the origins of Valentine's Day is very much a pagan festival, which is celebrated in the middle of February, and that's to commemorate the Valentine's death or burial, which occurred around 270 AD. And the Christian Church claims it was due to Saint Valentine's feast day, which is in the middle of February. And again, this is to Christianize the original pagan celebration of Lupercalia, if I pronounce it properly. So you can see that this is going on, where what would happen in this festival is the Roman priests would gather in a sacred cave, and the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, they were cared for by a wolf, supposedly, and the priest would sacrifice a goat for fertility and a dog for purification, and then they would strip the goat's hide into strips, dip them into the blood, and then go around the streets, and they would slap the women and the crop fields with this hide in order to make the women fertile and in order to make the crops bear. So you can see, again, very much pagan practices. It was actually banned by Christians because it was deemed un-Christian when they found the origins of it around the 5th century. But then Pope Gelasius declared the February the 14th as Saint Valentine's Day. And so this is where you see, so very much again, I can carry on a little bit more historical, that you can see its origins there. Mothering Day, Mother's Day, slightly different. It does trace its roots back to ancient Greeks and Romans, who held festivals in honor of the mother goddess Rhea and Cybele, or Sibyl, and this was the origin or the original practices of Mother's Day in the early Christian festival known as Mothering Sunday, which used to take place, and this used to fall on the 4th Sunday in Lent, and it was seen as a time when you were faithful to return to your mother church, which was the main church near the home, for a special service. And then over time it became more of a secular holiday, so that children would buy their mother flowers and tokens of appreciation. There's some history about what happened subsequently, but you can read the paper rather than me bore you to death with it. April's Fool, this is where pranksters would play jokes on each other. This is also called All Fool's Day. Again, there seems to be several different cultures in terms of its origins, some mystery. Some speculate that April Fool's Day dates to 1582, and it's about when France switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, and people who were slow to find out or recognize the change and the start of the new year had moved to January the 1st again, and they were still celebrating in the last week of April through April the 4th. Then they became the butt of jokes, because we mentioned how the Julian calendar considered March, springtime, as the time of the start of the new year, but the Gregorian calendar shifted the 1st. So this is where it all came about. Some have linked April Fool's Day to the ancient festivals of Hilaria, which were celebrated in Rome at the end of March, and people would dress up in disguises. And so there's some story about that. There's also some discussion around Scotland time. So again, you can see very much sort of pagan practices. There doesn't seem to be much religious element to this, but you can see that it did take place around the Roman time as well. And also you can see that ancient festivals, which were normally carried out in the sort of recognizing or appreciating a god. We then have Good Friday, Easter Sunday and Easter eggs. all Easter, and we're getting close to 10 minutes, so I'm going to finish soon. I don't think a 15-minute one was too long. Beyond 50 minutes is too long. Easter celebrates the Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead according to Christian belief, and it's the most important holiday. It can move around, as we know, and so clearly you can see the origins of this is Christian. There's talk about where the word Easter came from. Again, you can read the paper. There is a 40-day period which leads up to Easter Sunday, which is Lent. It's a time of reflection and penance, and represents the 40 days supposedly that Jesus spent alone in the wilderness before starting his ministry, and a time in which Christians believe he survived various temptations by the devil. Remember, this is the Christian understanding of it, not the Islamic understanding of it. But now, obviously, most things, like everything else, has become commercialized as we'll get to Christmas and things of that nature. Father's Day quite uniquely doesn't have a religious basis. It was actually founded around 1910 was the first time in the States, and then it wasn't until 1972 that President Woodrow Wilson made Mother's Day official, and likewise probably made Father's Day official as well. And it was Mother's Day that was an inspiration for Father's Day, just for a bit of equality, and I've already explained Mother's Day to you. So that's probably the only one which seems to have a non-religious basis, but it's basing it on Mother's Day. It's doing qiyas, if you can say, on Mother's Day. We then have Halloween, which we're very close to. Halloween is the time, obviously, between autumn and winter, which is a time of death, in the sense that plants and trees and things like that would die, and animals would be scarce, and other animals would go into hibernation. So it was a time also of celebrating, and obviously nights were long and days were short, so there was lots of noises and scary sounds. So Halloween became a time of celebration and superstition. Again, it's linked to the Celtic festival of Samhain, so it has pagan origins, and people would light bonfires and wear costumes to ward off ghosts and things of that nature. Around the 8th century, Pope Gregory III, he designated November the 1st as a time to honour the saints and the martyrs. So it became a religious day, All Saints' Day. So it took some of the traditions of Samhain and obviously a little bit new. The evening before got called, so the day was called All Saints' Day. The night before got called All Hallows' Eve. And eventually All Hallows' Eve, it became Halloween. And then eventually it became more of a secular activity as people became less religious. So you got, trick-or-treating and you got everything else which is associated with it. So we've clearly mentioned this was around 2,000 or so years ago. I've told Samhain is not pronounced Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. So my apologies. My Celtic is not too good. And it's marking the end of winter. So what they did was they'd build huge bonfires. People would gather, they'd burn crops, they'd burn animals as sacrifices to the Celtic deities, and they'd wear costumes, usually animal heads and skins, and tell each other fortunes. And when the celebration was over, they'd relit their fires, which they distinguished, and the sacred bonfire to help protect them from the coming winter. So when the Romans came across and they conquered most of the Celtic territory, there were two festivals of Roman origin which were combined with the Celtic origins, and this is how we see it going across into the Romans. And then Romans, obviously being Christians, then tried to Christianize it, and included within it the martyrs. So they had the Catholic Feast of All Martyrs' Day, and I've already touched upon that. So you're starting to see, as we saw, pagan cultures in most of these activities, these pagan religious activities, then becoming Christianized. Either they've been made illegal when it was realized that they could not remove them. Then instead what they try to do is Islamify them to Christianize them in order so that people could continue celebrating them, because it's too difficult to remove these cultures from the people, but at the same time make it religious. So that's that, and that's coming up to 40 minutes or so. So I will discuss the Christmas part in the next part. So in short, as I've just summarized, most of these acts are pagan in origin, which is to pagan gods, either English pagan or it can be rooted to Greek, to deities, and they were worship, superstitious acts. Things were done for that reason. And then when the Romans conquered these lands, the European lands, then they would try to Christianize, or they tried to ban them in places. It didn't work. Then they tried to Christianize them, and then they became a Christian act. So they brought Christian acts and associated them with the acts of the pagans in order to do that. So clearly, from an Islamic point of view, any act which has a basis in a religion, in this case paganism, or eventually Christianity, then Muslims can't celebrate them because of the fact that they are religious acts. Muslims can, however, celebrate those acts which are non-religious, and the only thing we could really find was Father's Day, and that Father's Day is qiyas upon Mother's Day. Generally speaking, obviously we should appreciate mothers, so that doesn't mean that we can't celebrate mothers throughout the year. We don't have to pick a particular day. We don't have to, okay, it might be that those things are available on those days, like Mother's Day stuff. So, okay, we might buy it's commercial now, so we might buy them on that day, but we don't associate it with that particular day. We can give them any time throughout the year, or through, gradually through the year, or any other date for that particular matter, not fixing a particular day. And likewise Father's Day, because in principle we respect our parents, we acknowledge our parents, and we gift our parents, but we can't gift them on a specific day that is called Mother's Day or Father's Day, because that has pagan origins, as it has to a certain extent Christian origins, especially with the Mother's Day, Father's Day being more secular. Hope that makes sense, and the paper's with it as well, inshallah. The next part I will discuss Christmas in detail. Lately obviously it's become more commercially orientated, but its foundations are based on Christianity. It's believed by Christians that this is the anniversary of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, as is referred to within Christianity. Obviously, according to Muslims, it's Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And then we start to see Santa Claus and things like that coming into play. But likewise, even again with the ones that I've explained in part one, where they have basis in pagan cultures, you see here, for example, that the Europeans also used to sort of rejoice the winter solstice. And this was a sort of, in Scandinavia, the Norse would celebrate Yule from December the 21st, and they would burn logs and things of that nature. We also have in Germany that people honoured the pagan god Odin in the midwinter holidays. They were terrified of Odin, and they believed that he would made nocturnal flights through the sky to observe his people. And people, because of his presence, people would stay inside. We then have Saturnalia, if I pronounce it correctly, and this is in Rome, where winters were very harsh, and there was a holiday was set up in honour of Saturn, the god of agriculture, which was celebrated, and this was a week up to the winter solstice. So this was a sort of a hedonistic time where people would eat food, drink, and obviously practice other activities, and people would just sort of try to remove the depression, so to speak, by these kind of celebrations. So this is what sort of went on around that type of the day. In early Christianity, Easter was the main holiday because the birth of Jesus was not celebrated. It was in the 4th century when the birth of Jesus was considered as a holiday. But the Bible does not mention the date of his birth. The shepherds herding seems to suggest it was most likely in spring rather than in winter. Well, anyway, that's a separate topic. Pope Julius I, he chose December the 25th, and it's believed that he chose this to adopt and absorb the traditions of the pagan Saturnalia festival, because of the fact that paganism was already quite rife, and as I've mentioned in part one, it was Christianizing the activities which existed already in order to make them religiously okay, and we're obviously now starting to see Islamification of Christian practices in order to consider them to be okay. There's more I could say about it, but I think that sort of touches upon the main points. We see that in the early 17th century, Christmas was outlawed. Oliver Cromwell and more the Puritans, when they took over England, they got rid of this decadence which they felt Christmas was becoming. It was like we saw with the Saturnalia, it was becoming a practice of decadence, excessive eating, excessive drinking, and obviously rude practices amongst one another. And then we see this developing over the centuries that will go past. It was Irving in the 19th century that brought especially Americans back to embracing Christmas. And we didn't see that much of an effect taking place in Britain, as it kept very much the same, and it started to sort of reinvent itself as a good practice. We have Christmas carol singing, and obviously the book The Christmas Carol, which was by the English author Charles Dickens, and he made it into a nice story to Christmas, in which importance of charity and goodwill and things of that nature, which people did like to see. And Americans began to embrace Christmas far better. We also have Christmas trees. Obviously, where did Christmas trees come about? Long before Christianity, as we see with most of these places, people liked to decorate their homes with pine, spruce, fir trees, anything evergreen really, because it brought good luck, it brought sort of fertility, and also it was believed that evergreens kept away witches, ghosts, evil spirits, superstitious behavior of that nature. And most ancient people believed that the sun was a god and that winter came every year because the sun god had become ill. So in order to remember and try to sort of wake up the sun god, they would have these evergreens to remind them of the green plants, and that eventually summer would return, the sun god would become stronger. We similarly see the ancient Egyptians worshipping a god called Ra, head of a hawk, and wore a sun as a blazing disc in his crown. And at the solstice, the Ra begins to recover from the illness, and the Egyptians would fill their homes with green palm rushes to symbolize life over death. Similarly, the Romans, they marked solstice with this feast, as already mentioned, Saturnalia, which was in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture. And this was to remind them that the farms and orchards would eventually become green and fruitful again, and they would decorate their homes and temples. More closer to home in Northern Europe, the Druids, the priests of the ancient Celts, they would decorate their temples with evergreens as a symbol of everlasting life. And the Vikings used evergreens as a special plant of the sun god Balder. It was Germany which is credited with the actual Christmas tree tradition as we know it now in the 16th century, and devout Christians would buy decorated trees bring them into their homes. Some built Christmas pyramids out of wood and decorated them with candles and evergreens, and it's widely rumoured that Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, was the first one who put lit candles on the tree when he was walking home one evening. Supposedly he saw the stars twinkling, and he wanted to kind of capture that in his own home, so he did that. It was a little bit later in America for that to take place, but you're seeing obviously that this has pagan customs again, and William Bradford, he tried to stamp out this pagan mockery, and he would penalise and for this frivolity. He would consider them to be heathen traditions. The heathen traditions he would call Christmas carols as a heathen tradition, decorating trees as a heathen tradition, and any joyful expression, as he regarded it, desecrating the sacred event. So you can see even the Puritan Christians saw the pagan basis for these practices. But eventually the will of the people won, and we see obviously in Britain, for example, with Queen Victoria, husband Albert, obviously from German background, the first Christmas tree arrives here. So we see this taking place. So again, very much pagan culture, which then was Christianized. We then have Christmas cards. This was sort of around the 1830s, which came about. But before that, the Celts and the Teutonic people had considered mistletoe to have magic powers. It had the ability to heal wounds and increase fertility. So you have this practice of kissing under the mistletoe, and they would hang them in order to bring good luck and ward off evil spirits. So again, pagan culture. Similarly, in Victorian time, the English would hang mistletoe from the ceilings. Carol singing also took place in England. It started in England, and it was really a performance that musicians did from town to town in order to receive either a hot meal or some money in order for them to continue to survive. Where did the tradition of hanging up stockings come about? It's supposedly Saint Nicholas, the legend says, that there were poor sisters who could not marry and they had no money for a dowry. So to save them from being sold, their father, who was called Saint Nick, left each of the three sisters gifts of gold coins. One went down the chimney and landed in a pair of shoes that had been left on the hearth. Another went into a window and into a pair of stockings left hanging by the fire to dry. So that's the tradition for the stocking. So again, you can see Christian tradition there. And turkey for Christmas. There's difference of views as to whether turkey. Some say turkey was introduced in the sort of 16th century. Others have said no, turkey's been synonymous with Christmas dinner. And there's been some debate about whether in earlier days, especially in people with poorer backgrounds, they couldn't afford to breed turkeys, so it would sometimes be a chicken or a goose or beef or rabbit, really anything they could afford. But others have argued no, that this has had a part to play, but it seems more than anything else that this was a later addition. And the turkeys seem to replace swans and other big birds around the Tudor period. So it seemed to become a Christmas sort of addition later on. So there you can see many of the traditions around Christmas, and obviously Christmas itself is very much based on pagan culture, as it always has been, and which has then been Christianized. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.